It was September 1976, and Joseph Pistone, a young FBI agent, had just embarked on an undercover operation that would change the course of his life and the history of law enforcement. He had assumed the identity of Donnie Brasco, a low-level jewel thief, and was about to infiltrate the notorious Bonanno crime family. The operation, codenamed Sun Apple, was a high-stakes gamble, with Pistone's life hanging in the balance. As Donnie Brasco, Pistone was tasked with gaining the trust of the Bonanno family's members, particularly Anthony Murrah and Dominic Napolitano, also known as Sonny Black. Born in 1939 in Erie, Pennsylvania, to an Italian family, Pistone's heritage and fluency in Italian and Sicilian dialects made him an ideal candidate for the operation. His background, including his time at Patterson State College, where he studied anthropology, and his experience as a teacher and a naval intelligence officer, had prepared him for the challenges he would face. Pistone's journey into the world of organized crime began with a series of careful preparations, including FBI gemology courses and the creation of a false backstory. He was to pose as a jewel thief from Miami, Florida, and his mission was to gather evidence and intelligence on the Bonanno family's activities. The FBI had erased Pistone's name from their office rolls, and he was now a ghost, living a double life as Donnie Brasco. But that wasn't the strangest part. Pistone's operation was initially intended to last only 6 months, but it would eventually span several years, putting him in the crosshairs of some of the most powerful and ruthless men in the mafia. As Pistone navigated the complex web of alliances and rivalries within the Bonanno family, he formed a close bond with Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, a veteran mobster who would become his mentor and friend. Lefty, a soldier in the Bonanno family, was a lot better connected and respected than the crew Pistone had initially infiltrated, and he saw potential in the young jewel thief. Through Lefty, Pistone gained access to the upper echelons of the mafia, meeting captains and bosses, including Sonny Black, who would later become a key player in the operation. But as Pistone delved deeper into the world of organized crime, he began to realize the enormity of the risks he was taking. The mafia was a ruthless and unforgiving organization, and one misstep could mean death. The FBI, too, was taking a huge gamble by allowing Pistone to go undercover, as the agency's former director, J. Edgar Hoover, had always been skeptical of such operations, fearing that agents might become corrupted. Yet, Pistone's work would eventually prove to be a crucial tool in law enforcement, leading to over 200 indictments and 100 convictions of mafia members. As the operation progressed, Pistone found himself walking a tightrope between his loyalty to the FBI and his growing friendship with Lefty. He was gathering valuable intelligence, but he was also forming genuine bonds with the people he was investigating. The line between right and wrong was becoming increasingly blurred, and Pistone knew that he had to be careful not to cross it. But that wasn't the only challenge he faced. The mafia was a complex and treacherous world, full of power struggles and rivalries, and Pistone had to navigate it carefully to survive. The Bonanno family, in particular, was a labyrinth of alliances and rivalries, with different factions vying for power and control. Pistone's association with Lefty and Sonny Black had given him a foothold in the organization, but he knew that he had to be careful not to antagonize the wrong people. The mafia was a world where loyalty and respect were paramount, and Pistone had to earn them if he was to survive. But as he navigated this treacherous landscape, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen if his true identity was discovered. The consequences would be deadly, not just for him, but for his family and everyone he had come to care about in the mafia. As Pistone delved deeper into the world of the Bonanno crime family, he found himself walking a thin line between loyalty and deception. His relationship with Lefty Ruggiero, a seasoned mafia hitman, was particularly crucial in gaining the trust of the higher-ups. But with this newfound trust came increased scrutiny, and Pistone had to be meticulous in his actions to avoid raising any suspicions. He began to participate in various mafia activities, including hijackings and shakedowns, all while secretly gathering evidence for the FBI. The operation was yielding valuable results, but Pistone couldn't shake off the feeling that he was in over his head. The FBI, meanwhile, was closely monitoring Pistone's progress, and the agency's director was eager to see the operation come to a successful conclusion. But Pistone's handlers were also aware of the risks involved and were keeping a close eye on the situation. They knew that if Pistone's cover was blown, it would not only put his life in danger, but also jeopardize the entire operation. The stakes were high, and the tension was palpable. But that wasn't the strangest part. Pistone's immersion in the mafia lifestyle was starting to take a toll on his personal life. He was spending months without seeing his wife and daughters, and the emotional strain was beginning to show. As Pistone navigated the complex web of mafia relationships, he found himself drawn into a world of petty squabbles and power struggles. The Bonanno family was plagued by internal conflicts, with various factions vying for control. Pistone's association with Lefty Ruggiero had earned him a degree of respect, but he was also seen as a potential threat by some of the other family members. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Pistone was being courted by multiple factions, each with their own agenda. He was being pulled in different directions, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep his true loyalties hidden. The FBI, meanwhile, was analyzing the intelligence gathered by Pistone, and the evidence was painting a damning picture of the mafia's activities. The agency was building a case against the Bonanno family, and Pistone's testimony would be crucial in securing convictions. But Pistone's handlers were also aware that the mafia would stop at nothing to protect their interests. They knew that if Pistone's cover was blown, the consequences would be deadly, not just for him, but for his family and everyone he had come to care about in the mafia. The operation was reaching a critical point, and the next few weeks would be crucial in determining its outcome. As the stakes continued to rise, Pistone found himself facing a daunting challenge. He had to balance his loyalty to the FBI with his growing affinity for the mafia members he had come to know. Lefty Ruggiero, in particular, had become a close friend, and Pistone felt a deep sense of loyalty towards him. But he also knew that his ultimate goal was to bring down the mafia, and that meant betraying the trust of those he had grown to care about. The moral complexity of the situation was weighing heavily on Pistone's mind, and he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would he be able to see the operation through to its conclusion, or would he become the mafia's next victim? The FBI, meanwhile, was preparing for the possibility that Pistone's cover might be blown at any moment. They had a contingency plan in place, but it was far from foolproof. The agency knew that the mafia would do everything in their power to silence Pistone, and that meant taking drastic measures to protect him. The situation was becoming increasingly volatile, and it was clear that the outcome would depend on a delicate balance of power and deception. As the days turned into weeks, Pistone found himself living on borrowed time, never knowing when his luck might run out. But that wasn't the most alarming part. The mafia was starting to suspect that there was a rat in their midst, and Pistone's name was at the top of the list. As Pistone navigated the treacherous world of the Bonanno crime family, he found himself increasingly entangled in a web of loyalty and deception. His relationship with Lefty Ruggiero, in particular, had become a delicate balancing act, with Pistone walking a fine line between gaining Lefty's trust and avoiding suspicion. But that wasn't the most challenging part. Pistone's FBI handlers were growing anxious about the operation's duration and the risks involved. They had initially envisioned a 6-month undercover stint, but as the months turned into years, the stakes had escalated, and the possibility of Pistone being discovered had become a constant threat. The FBI's concerns were not unfounded, as the Bonanno family was known for its ruthlessness and paranoia. The recent murders of 3 powerful captains had sent shockwaves through the organization, and the atmosphere was tense with suspicion and mistrust. Pistone's position was precarious, to say the least, and his handlers were eager to bring him in before it was too late. But Pistone was determined to see the operation through, convinced that he was on the cusp of a major breakthrough. He had gained the trust of key figures like Lefty and Sonny Black, and he was confident that he could gather enough evidence to bring down the entire organization. But that wasn't the only factor at play. Pistone's personal life was also beginning to suffer. He had been undercover for so long that he had barely seen his wife and daughters, and the strain was starting to show. His marriage was deteriorating, and he was struggling to maintain a connection with his loved ones. The emotional toll of living a double life was taking its toll, and Pistone was starting to wonder if it was all worth it. And then, there was the issue of Anthony Murrah, who had initially introduced Pistone to the Bonanno family. Murrah had been sent back to prison, but his claim on Pistone had not been forgotten, and it was about to become a major point of contention. As the weeks turned into months, Pistone found himself at the center of a bitter dispute between Mura, Lefty, and Sonny Black. Each of them claimed ownership of Pistone, and the situation was on the verge of escalating into a full-blown conflict. Pistone was torn between his loyalty to Lefty, who had become like a mentor to him, and his growing unease with the situation. He knew that he had to tread carefully, as one misstep could mean disaster. But that wasn't the strangest part. Pistone had also started to form a genuine bond with Lefty, who was struggling with his own personal demons. Lefty's family issues and his perception of being underappreciated within the crew had created a sense of vulnerability, and Pistone found himself drawn to the older man's plight. As Pistone navigated this complex web of relationships, he was also gathering evidence that would eventually lead to the downfall of the Bonanno family. He had been using wiretaps and other surveillance techniques to gather intel, and the information was starting to paint a damning picture of the organization's inner workings. But the more he learned, the more he realized that the mafia was not just a criminal organization, it was a complex social hierarchy with its own rules and rituals. And Pistone, as Donnie Brasco, was about to become a part of it in a way that he never could have imagined. The FBI was getting ready to pull the plug on the operation, but Pistone was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. With only 6 weeks left until he was scheduled to come out of Undercover, Pistone was about to embark on the most dangerous and thrilling phase of his mission yet. The stakes were higher than ever, and Pistone's handlers were on edge. They knew that the longer he stayed undercover, the greater the risk of him being discovered. But Pistone was resolute, driven by a desire to prove that the mafia was not invincible. He was willing to push the limits, to take risks that would put him in harm's way, all in the pursuit of justice. And as he delved deeper into the heart of the Bonanno family, he began to realize that the line between loyalty and deception was thinning. He was no longer just an undercover agent, he was Donnie Brasco, a man with a reputation to uphold and a future to secure. But at what cost? The answer would have to wait, as Pistone was about to receive an offer that would change everything. He was to be made a member of the mafia, a privilege that came with a steep price. Pistone knew that this was the moment of truth, the moment that would define his mission and his future. Would he accept the offer, or would he find a way to extricate himself from the situation? The decision would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Pistone, but for the entire Bonanno family. As Pistone weighed the pros and cons of accepting the offer to become a made man, he knew that this decision would not only affect his own life, but also the lives of those around him, including his family and his FBI colleagues. The FBI had already begun to express concerns about the operation, and the recent murders of 3 powerful captains had sent a clear message that the Bonanno family was not to be trifled with. But Pistone was determined to see this through, convinced that becoming a made man would give him the ultimate proof that the mafia was not invincible. But that wasn't the only factor at play. Pistone's relationship with Lefty Ruggiero had become increasingly complicated, and he knew that if he were to accept the offer, it would likely mean the end of their friendship. Lefty had become like a father to him, and the thought of betraying him was almost too much to bear. And yet, Pistone also knew that he couldn't back down now, not after all the time and effort he had invested in the operation. The stakes were too high, and the potential reward too great. As he deliberated, Pistone couldn't help but think about the other players involved in the operation. There was Sonny Black, the ruthless captain who seemed to stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And then there was Anthony Mura, the soldier who had first introduced Pistone to the Bonanno family. Each of them had their own agenda, their own motivations, and Pistone knew that he had to navigate these complex web of relationships carefully if he was to succeed. But what really caught Pistone's attention was the fact that the Bonanno family was on the brink of a major power struggle. With the recent murders, the family was in disarray, and it seemed that anyone could be a target. Pistone knew that this was a dangerous time to be an undercover agent, but he also saw it as an opportunity to gather even more evidence and to get closer to the heart of the organization. And so, with a sense of trepidation and anticipation, Pistone made his decision. He would accept the offer, and he would become a made man. The days that followed were a blur of activity, as Pistone prepared for the initiation ceremony. He was given a series of tasks to complete, each one designed to test his loyalty and his commitment to the family. And through it all, Pistone played the role of Donnie Brasco, the loyal and trusted associate, all the while gathering evidence and reporting back to the FBI. But as the day of the initiation ceremony drew near, Pistone couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The atmosphere was tense, and the players seemed to be maneuvering for position. It was as if everyone knew that the stakes were high and that the outcome was far from certain. And then, just as Pistone was about to take the final step, he received a message from the FBI. The operation was being shut down, and he was to extract himself immediately. The danger had become too great, and the FBI could no longer guarantee his safety. Pistone was stunned. He had come so far, and he was so close to achieving his goal. But he also knew that he couldn't argue with the FBI. The decision had been made, and he had to accept it. And so, with a sense of disappointment and frustration, Pistone began to make his exit, leaving behind the world of the Bonanno family and the role of Donnie Brasco. But the story doesn't end there. As Pistone extracted himself from the operation, he knew that the consequences of his actions would be far-reaching. The Bonanno family would likely retaliate, and the players involved would have to face the music. And Pistone himself would have to come to terms with the fact that he had been living a lie for so long. The experience had changed him, and he knew that he would never be the same again. The question was, what would happen next? Would the FBI be able to bring the Bonanno family to justice, or would the operation end in disaster? The answer would have to wait, as Pistone and the FBI embarked on the next phase of the operation, one that would take them to the very heart of the mafia. As Pistone delved deeper into the Bonanno crime family, he found himself walking a thin line between his loyalty to the FBI and his growing bond with the mafia members. His relationship with Lefty Ruggiero, in particular, had become a crucial aspect of the operation, providing him with valuable insight into the inner workings of the organization. But that wasn't the only complicated aspect of Pistone's life. His marriage was also beginning to suffer, as he spent more and more time away from his family, unable to share his true identity with them. The FBI, meanwhile, was growing increasingly concerned about the safety of their undercover agent. With the Bonanno family's infighting and power struggles escalating, the risk of Pistone being discovered was higher than ever. The Bureau's director, J. Edgar Hoover, had always been hesitant about using undercover agents, fearing that they might become too entrenched in the criminal world and lose their way. But Pistone's operation was proving to be a game changer, providing the FBI with unprecedented access to the inner workings of the mafia. As Pistone navigated the treacherous world of organized crime, he began to realize that the mafia was not just a simple hierarchical structure, but a complex web of relationships and alliances. The Bonanno family, in particular, was plagued by internal power struggles, with different factions vying for control. Pistone's association with Lefty Ruggiero had given him a foothold in the organization, but he knew that he needed to be careful not to get caught in the crossfire. One of the most significant challenges Pistone faced was the issue of loyalty. As he gained the trust of the mafia members, he was constantly reminded of the importance of omerta, the code of silence that bound them together. But Pistone's loyalty lay with the FBI, and he knew that he had to be careful not to compromise his mission. The FBI, meanwhile, was working tirelessly to gather evidence and build a case against the Bonanno family. The operation was a massive undertaking, involving countless hours of surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover work. As the stakes grew higher, Pistone found himself in an increasingly precarious position. He was being pulled in different directions, with the mafia members pushing him to prove his loyalty, and the FBI urging him to stay focused on the mission. But Pistone was a seasoned operative, and he knew how to navigate the complex web of relationships and alliances. He was determined to see the operation through to its conclusion, no matter what the cost. The Bonanno family, meanwhile, was on the brink of chaos. The power struggles between the different factions were escalating, and it seemed as though the organization was on the verge of imploding. Pistone's association with Lefty Ruggiero had given him a unique perspective on the inner workings of the family, and he knew that the situation was more volatile than ever. The FBI, sensing that the operation was reaching a critical juncture, was preparing to make its move. The question was, what would happen next? Would Pistone be able to bring the Bonanno family to justice, or would the operation end in disaster? As the days turned into weeks, Pistone found himself in a desperate bid to stay one step ahead of the mafia. He was being pulled in different directions, with the FBI pushing him to gather more evidence, and the mafia members urging him to prove his loyalty. But Pistone was a master of deception, and he knew how to keep his cool under pressure. He was determined to see the operation through to its conclusion, no matter what the cost. The stakes were higher than ever, and Pistone knew that he was running out of time. The Bonanno family was on the brink of chaos, and Pistone was right in the middle of it. The FBI, meanwhile, was working tirelessly to build a case against the Bonanno family. The operation was a massive undertaking, involving countless hours of surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover work. Pistone's evidence was crucial to the case, and the FBI was determined to get as much information as possible. But the mafia was not going down without a fight, and Pistone knew that he was in grave danger. The Bonanno family was notorious for its brutality, and Pistone knew that he would be lucky to get out alive. As the operation reached its climax, Pistone found himself in a desperate bid to stay alive. He was being pulled in different directions, with the FBI pushing him to gather more evidence and the mafia members urging him to prove his loyalty. But Pistone was a seasoned operative, and he knew how to navigate the complex web of relationships and alliances. He was determined to see the operation through to its conclusion, no matter what the cost. The stakes were higher than ever, and Pistone knew that he was running out of time. The Bonanno family was on the brink of chaos, and Pistone was right in the middle of it. But that wasn't the strangest part. Pistone was about to discover that the mafia was not the only organization with secrets to hide. As Pistone navigated the complex web of loyalty and deception within the Bonanno crime family, he found himself at the center of a heated dispute over who controlled his allegiance. Anthony Murrah, the soldier who had first introduced Pistone to the family, claimed ownership of the undercover agent, citing his role in bringing Brasco into the fold. However, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, Pistone's close friend and confidant, argued that he had been the first to stake a claim on Brasco, and therefore he was the one who truly owned him. Meanwhile, Captain Dominic "Sonny" Black Napolitano, who had been impressed by Brasco's lucrative business ventures, believed that he had the ultimate authority over the undercover agent. This power struggle would have significant implications for Pistone's safety and the success of the operation. But that wasn't the only challenge Pistone faced. As he delved deeper into the world of organized crime, he began to experience the toll it took on his personal life. He spent months without seeing his wife and 3 daughters, and the strain on his relationships was starting to show. His marriage was suffering, and the guilt of living a double life was eating away at him. Despite these difficulties, Pistone remained committed to the operation, driven by his determination to bring down the Bonanno crime family and prove that the mafia was not invincible. As the stakes continued to rise, Pistone found himself walking a thin line between his loyalty to the FBI and his allegiance to the men he had come to regard as friends. The FBI, too, was growing increasingly concerned about the operation. With 3 powerful captains murdered in a matter of months, the agency knew that Pistone's cover could be blown at any moment. The danger was palpable, and the FBI wanted to pull the plug on the operation to protect their agent. But Pistone was resolute, convinced that he was on the cusp of a major breakthrough. He had gained the trust of the Bonanno family, and he was determined to see it through to the end. The FBI eventually agreed to let Pistone stay undercover, but only until he was made a milestone that would mark his formal induction into the mafia. The clock was ticking, and Pistone knew that he had only 6 weeks left to achieve his goal before the operation would be shut down for good. As the days turned into weeks, Pistone found himself drawn deeper into the inner workings of the Bonanno crime family. He was ordered to participate in a series of lucrative business ventures, including the King's Court Bottle Club in Florida, which would cement his relationship with the Bonannos and Santo Trafficante, a powerful mob boss. But with each new success came increased scrutiny, and Pistone knew that he was living on borrowed time. The mafia was notorious for its ruthlessness, and if his cover was blown, he would be the first to suffer the consequences. The tension was building, and Pistone couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the mafia was closing in on him. And then, just as he thought things couldn't get any more complicated, he received an order that would change everything he was to kill Anthony Bruno Indelicato, a made man in the Bonanno crime family. This new development raised the stakes to unprecedented heights. Pistone was being asked to commit a murder, a crime that would not only violate his oath as an FBI agent, but also seal his fate as a member of the mafia. He knew that he couldn't go through with it, but he also knew that refusing would mean certain death. The FBI had to intervene and fast to prevent a catastrophe. But as they scrambled to come up with a plan, Pistone was left to navigate the treacherous landscape of the mafia, where one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. The clock was ticking, and the fate of the operation hung in the balance. Would Pistone be able to escape the mafia's clutches, or would he become the latest casualty of the war on organized crime? The outcome was far from certain, and the world held its breath as the undercover agent walked the thin line between loyalty and deception. As the days ticked by, Pistone found himself deeper in the mafia's inner circle, with the Bonanno family's leaders taking notice of his work. The tension was palpable, and the FBI was getting anxious about the operation's duration. They had initially planned for it to last 6 months, but it had already been years, and the risks were escalating. But Pistone was determined to see it through, to become a made man and gather enough evidence to bring down the mafia's top brass. He was playing a dangerous game, walking a thin line between loyalty and deception, and the consequences of being caught were dire. But that wasn't the only challenge Pistone faced. His personal life was suffering, and his relationship with his wife and daughters was strained. He had to balance his undercover life with his real one, and it was taking a toll on his mental health. The FBI was also getting concerned about the emotional toll the operation was taking on Pistone, and they were debating whether to pull him out. However, Pistone was adamant that he could see it through, that he could maintain his cover and gather the evidence they needed. The stakes were high, and the outcome was far from certain. As Pistone navigated the complex web of mafia alliances and rivalries, he found himself at the center of a power struggle. The Bonanno family was in turmoil, with different factions vying for control, and Pistone was caught in the middle. He had to tread carefully, making sure not to alienate any of the key players, while also gathering as much evidence as possible. The FBI was monitoring the situation closely, and they were amazed at Pistone's ability to stay one step ahead of the game. But they knew that it couldn't last forever, that eventually Pistone would be found out, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The final weeks of the operation were the most intense. Pistone was ordered to kill Anthony Bruno Indelicato, a rival mafia member, as a test of his loyalty. But Pistone knew that he couldn't go through with it, that it would be a death sentence for him and his family. He had to come up with a plan to find a way to get out of the situation without arousing suspicion. The FBI was on high alert, waiting for Pistone's signal to extract him from the operation. But Pistone was determined to see it through, to gather as much evidence as possible and bring down the mafia's top leaders. As the clock ticked down, Pistone's nerves were on edge. He knew that he was running out of time, that the mafia was getting suspicious, and that the FBI was getting anxious. He had to stay focused, to keep his cool, and to see the operation through to the end. The stakes were high, and the outcome was far from certain. But Pistone was a seasoned pro, and he was determined to come out on top. The question was, would he be able to escape the mafia's clutches, or would he become the latest casualty of the war on organized crime? The operation was a huge success, with over 200 indictments and 100 convictions of mafia members. Pistone's work had paid off, and he had proven that the mafia was not invincible. But the cost had been high, and Pistone had paid a personal price for his bravery. He had to live with the knowledge of what he had done, of the lies he had told, and the people he had deceived. The experience had left him changed, and he would never be the same again. As he looked back on the operation, he couldn't help but wonder, what would have happened if he had been caught? If the mafia had discovered his true identity? And what would be the ultimate legacy of his work as Donnie Brasco? Would the mafia ever be truly dismantled? Or would it simply evolve and rise again from the ashes? The legacy of Donnie Brasco's work continues to be felt today, with many experts arguing that his infiltration of the Bonanno crime family marked a significant turning point in the FBI's war against organized crime. However, as we delve deeper into the operation, it becomes clear that the story of Donnie Brasco is far more complex and nuanced than initially meets the eye. For instance, the FBI's decision to send an undercover agent into the mafia was not without its risks, and the agency had to carefully weigh the potential benefits against the potential costs. But that wasn't the only consideration, as the FBI also had to navigate the delicate balance between gathering intelligence and avoiding entanglement in the very criminal activities they were seeking to disrupt. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Donnie Brasco operation is the way in which it highlights the blurred lines between right and wrong in the world of undercover policing. As an agent, Joseph Pistone was tasked with building relationships and gaining the trust of his mafia counterparts, all while secretly gathering evidence and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But in order to do so, he had to become a part of the very world he was seeking to dismantle, and this raised some difficult questions about the nature of identity and loyalty. For example, Pistone has spoken publicly about the ways in which he had to reconcile his own moral code with the demands of his undercover role, and the ways in which he struggled to maintain a sense of himself amidst the chaos and deception. But what's even more intriguing is the fact that Pistone's handlers at the FBI were also grappling with their own moral dilemmas, as they worked to balance the need for results against the risks of compromising their agent's safety and integrity. As the operation progressed, Pistone found himself drawn deeper and deeper into the inner workings of the Bonanno crime family, and he began to uncover some surprising contradictions and complications. For instance, despite their reputation for brutality and ruthlessness, many of the mafia members he encountered were also surprisingly charismatic and even likable, and Pistone found himself forming bonds with them that went beyond mere professional courtesy. But that wasn't the only surprise in store for him, as he also discovered that the mafia was far more sophisticated and organized than he had initially suspected, with a complex network of relationships and alliances that stretched all the way to the top of the organization. And yet, despite these revelations, Pistone remained committed to his mission, and he continued to gather intelligence and wait for the perfect moment to strike. But what he didn't know was that his actions were about to have some unexpected consequences, and that the mafia was not going to take his betrayal lying down. The fallout from the Donnie Brasco operation was intense and far-reaching, with the mafia launching a series of violent reprisals against anyone they suspected of being involved. But what's even more remarkable is the way in which the operation also sparked a series of internal power struggles within the FBI, as different agents and officials vied for credit and control. For example, Pistone's handlers were hailed as heroes for their role in the operation, but they also faced criticism and scrutiny from other quarters, with some arguing that they had taken unnecessary risks and compromised the integrity of the investigation. And yet, despite these challenges, the legacy of Donnie Brasco continues to endure, with many experts arguing that the operation marked a major turning point in the war against organized crime. But that wasn't the only lasting impact, as the operation also raised some important questions about the nature of undercover policing and the ethics of deception. For instance, can an agent ever truly infiltrate a criminal organization without becoming complicit in their activities? And what are the long-term consequences of such an operation for the agent themselves? As we continue to explore the complexities of the Donnie Brasco operation, it becomes clear that the story is far from over. In fact, the aftermath of the operation was marked by a series of unexpected twists and turns, as Pistone and his handlers worked to deal with the fallout and secure the convictions of their targets. But what's even more fascinating is the way in which the operation also sparked a series of new investigations and initiatives, as the FBI sought to build on the momentum and take down even more of the mafia's top leaders. For example, the FBI launched a series of new undercover operations, using the lessons they had learned from Donnie Brasco to inform and guide their tactics. And yet, despite these efforts, the mafia continued to evolve and adapt, finding new ways to evade detection and maintain their grip on power. But that wasn't the only challenge facing the FBI, as they also had to navigate the complex and often treacherous world of interagency politics, where different organizations and officials vied for control and resources. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Donnie Brasco operation is the way in which it highlights the ongoing cat-and-mouse game between law enforcement and organized crime. As the FBI and other agencies work to develop new strategies and tactics, the mafia and other criminal organizations are constantly adapting and evolving, seeking to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. For instance, the rise of new technologies and communication platforms has created new opportunities for the mafia to operate and coordinate, and the FBI has had to work hard to keep pace. But what's even more remarkable is the way in which the Donnie Brasco operation has become a kind of touchstone for this ongoing struggle, with many experts arguing that it marked a major turning point in the war against organized crime. And yet, despite this legacy, the operation also raises some important questions about the nature of progress and the challenges that still lie ahead. For example, can the FBI ever truly dismantle the mafia, or will it simply continue to evolve and mutate, adapting to the changing landscape of crime and law enforcement? As we delve deeper into the world of undercover policing and organized crime, it becomes clear that the story of Donnie Brasco is just one part of a much larger and more complex narrative. For instance, the operation was just one of many undercover initiatives launched by the FBI during the 1970s and 1980, and it was part of a broader effort to take down the mafia and disrupt their operations. But what's even more fascinating is the way in which the operation also intersected with other major events and trends of the time, from the rise of the mafia's involvement in labor racketeering to the growing awareness of the importance of organized crime as a major national security threat. And yet, despite these connections, the Donnie Brasco operation remains a unique and fascinating case study, offering insights into the complexities and challenges of undercover policing and the ongoing struggle against organized crime. But that wasn't the only surprise in store, as the operation also had some unexpected consequences for the FBI and the wider law enforcement community, and it raised important questions about the nature of loyalty and betrayal in the world of undercover policing. The investigation into the Bonanno crime family and the aftermath of the Donnie Brasco operation also highlighted the importance of international cooperation in the fight against organized crime. As the FBI and other agencies worked to disrupt the mafia's global operations, they had to navigate a complex web of relationships and alliances with other countries and law enforcement organizations. For example, the FBI worked closely with Italian authorities to take down key mafia leaders and disrupt their operations, and they also collaborated with other international partners to share intelligence and best practices. But what's even more remarkable is the way in which the Donnie Brasco operation also sparked a series of new initiatives and partnerships, as the FBI and other agencies sought to build on the momentum and take down even more of the mafia's top leaders. And yet, despite these efforts, the mafia continued to evolve and adapt, finding new ways to evade detection and maintain their grip on power. But that wasn't the only challenge facing the FBI, as they also had to navigate the complex and often treacherous world of interagency politics, where different organizations and officials vied for control and resources. As we explore the complexities of the Donnie Brasco operation and its aftermath, it becomes clear that the story is far from over. In fact, the legacy of the operation continues to be felt today, with many experts arguing that it marked a major turning point in the war against organized crime. But what's even more fascinating is the way in which the operation also raised important questions about the nature of undercover policing and the ethics of deception. For instance, can an agent ever truly infiltrate a criminal organization without becoming complicit in their activities? And what are the long-term consequences of such an operation for the agent themselves? And yet, despite these challenges, the Donnie Brasco operation remains a powerful example of the impact that undercover policing can have, and it continues to inspire new generations of law enforcement officials and policymakers. But that wasn't the only lasting impact, as the operation also sparked a series of new investigations and initiatives, as the FBI sought to build on the momentum and take down even more of the mafia's top leaders. The story of Donnie Brasco is also a testament to the bravery and dedication of the men and women who work in law enforcement, often putting their lives on the line to protect the public and uphold the law. For instance, Joseph Pistone and his handlers faced enormous risks and challenges throughout the operation, and they had to make difficult decisions and sacrifices in order to see it through to the end. But what's even more remarkable is the way in which the operation also highlights the importance of teamwork and collaboration in law enforcement, as agents and officials from different agencies and organizations work together to achieve a common goal. And yet, despite these successes, the Donnie Brasco operation also raises important questions about the nature of progress and the challenges that still lie ahead. For example, can the FBI ever truly dismantle the mafia, or will it simply continue to evolve and mutate, adapting to the changing landscape of crime and law enforcement? But that wasn't the only question on the table, as the operation also sparked a series of new debates and discussions about the role of law enforcement in society, and the ways in which agencies can work to build trust and legitimacy with the communities they serve. As we continue to explore the complexities of the Donnie Brasco operation, it becomes clear that the story is far more nuanced and multifaceted than initially meets the eye. For instance, the operation was not just a simple case of good versus evil, but rather a complex and often ambiguous struggle between different groups and individuals with their own motivations and agendas. But what's even more fascinating is the way in which the operation also highlights the importance of context and history in understanding the world of organized crime. For example, the rise of the mafia in the United States was closely tied to the social and economic conditions of the time, and the organization's evolution and adaptation were shaped by a complex array of factors and influences. And yet, despite these complexities, the Donnie Brasco operation remains a powerful example of the impact that law enforcement can have, and it continues to inspire new generations of officials and policymakers. But that wasn't the only lasting impact, as the operation also sparked a series of new investigations and initiatives, as the FBI sought to build on the momentum and take down even more of the mafia's top leaders. As the FBI continued to build on the momentum of Operation Donnie Brasco, they began to uncover a web of corruption that went far beyond the Bonanno crime family. The investigation led to a series of high-profile arrests and convictions, including that of Anthony Indelicato, a high-ranking member of the Bonanno family who was implicated in the murder of 3 rival gang members. But what's remarkable about Indelicato's case is that he was also a close associate of Joseph Massino, the powerful boss of the Bonanno family, who would later become a key informant for the FBI. This complex relationship between Indelicato and Massino would ultimately prove to be a crucial factor in the downfall of the Bonanno family, as the FBI used the information gathered from Operation Donnie Brasco to build a case against Massino and his top lieutenants. The FBI's strategy was to use the evidence gathered from Operation Donnie Brasco to create a ripple effect, taking down lower-level operatives and working their way up the chain of command. But as they delved deeper into the world of organized crime, they encountered a surprising level of sophistication and cunning. The mafia had evolved over the years, adapting to new technologies and new law enforcement tactics, and they were determined to stay one step ahead of the FBI. For example, the Bonanno family had developed a complex system of coded messages and secret meetings, making it difficult for the FBI to gather concrete evidence. But that wasn't the only challenge the FBI faced, as they also had to contend with the mafia's extensive network of corrupt officials and businessmen who were willing to do their bidding. One of the most significant complications that arose during this period was the issue of witness protection. As the FBI began to gather more evidence and build cases against top mafia leaders, they needed to ensure that their witnesses were safe from retaliation. But the witness protection program was still in its infancy, and the FBI was struggling to balance the need to protect their witnesses with the need to bring the mafia to justice. It was a delicate balancing act, and one that would ultimately have far-reaching consequences. For instance, the FBI had to relocate several witnesses to safe houses where they were given new identities and protected around the clock. But even with these precautions, there were still risks involved, and the FBI had to be constantly on guard against potential threats. As the investigation continued to unfold, the FBI began to uncover some surprising contradictions. On the one hand, the mafia was known for its brutal violence and ruthless tactics, but on the other hand, they were also capable of great loyalty and honor. This paradox was perhaps best exemplified by the figure of Joseph Massino, who was both a ruthless killer and a devoted family man. Massino's complex personality would ultimately prove to be a key factor in the FBI's strategy, as they sought to exploit his weaknesses and turn him into an informant. But that wasn't the only surprise in store for the FBI, as they soon discovered that Massino was not the only high-ranking member of the Bonanno family who was willing to cooperate with the authorities. The FBI's pursuit of Massino and his associates led them down a complex trail of clues and misdirection. As they dug deeper, they began to uncover a web of deceit and corruption that went all the way to the top of the Bonanno family. But just as they thought they were closing in on their target, they would hit a roadblock or a dead end. It was a frustrating and sometimes demoralizing process, but the FBI refused to give up. They were driven by a fierce determination to bring the mafia to justice, no matter what it took. And then, just when they thought they had finally got their man, they would receive a cryptic message or a tantalizing hint that suggested there was more to the story than they had initially suspected. But that wasn't the strangest part, as the FBI soon discovered that Massino's cooperation was not just a simple case of a mafia leader turning informant. As the FBI continued to build their case against the Bonanno family, they began to realize that the mafia's influence extended far beyond the world of organized crime. They had tentacles that reached into the highest levels of government and business, and they were willing to do whatever it took to maintain their power and influence. It was a sobering realization, and one that raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of corruption and the rule of law. The FBI's investigation had started as a straightforward case of mafia infiltration, but it had quickly evolved into something much more complex and far-reaching. And as they dug deeper, they began to uncover a complex network of relationships and alliances that threatened to upend everything they thought they knew about the mafia and its place in American society. The FBI's pursuit of the Bonanno family had also sparked a series of turf wars and power struggles within the mafia itself. As the FBI closed in on their targets, the various mafia families began to turn on each other, each seeking to protect their own interests and territories. It was a chaotic and sometimes bloody process, with alliances shifting and tempers flaring. But the FBI saw an opportunity in the chaos, using the divisions within the mafia to their advantage as they built their case against the Bonanno family. And then, just as it seemed like the dust was starting to settle, a new player would emerge, throwing everything into chaos once again. It was a dizzying and unpredictable landscape, and one that required the FBI to be constantly on their toes. As the investigation reached its climax, the FBI found themselves facing a series of difficult choices and trade-offs. On the one hand, they had to balance the need to bring the mafia to justice with the need to protect their witnesses and informants. On the other hand, they had to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries within the mafia, all while staying one step ahead of their targets. It was a delicate and sometimes perilous balancing act, and one that required great skill and cunning. But the FBI was driven by a fierce determination to succeed, and they were willing to do whatever it took to bring the mafia to its knees. And then, just as they thought they had finally achieved their goal, they would receive a shocking revelation that would throw everything into question once again. The FBI's investigation had started as a straightforward case of mafia infiltration, but it had evolved into something much more complex and far-reaching. As they delved deeper into the world of organized crime, they had uncovered a web of corruption and deceit that threatened to upend everything they thought they knew about the mafia and its place in American society. It was a sobering realization, and one that raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and influence. But the FBI had also discovered something else, something that gave them hope for the future. They had discovered that even in the darkest corners of the mafia, there were still men and women of honor and integrity who were willing to stand up for what was right and fight against the forces of corruption. And it was this discovery that would ultimately prove to be the most significant legacy of Operation Donnie Brasco, as the FBI continued to build on the momentum of their investigation and push forward into the unknown. As the dust finally began to settle on the Bonanno family, the FBI took stock of what they had achieved. They had brought down a powerful mafia family, and they had sent a powerful message to the rest of the mafia. But they had also uncovered a complex web of corruption and deceit that went far beyond the world of organized crime. It was a sobering realization, and one that raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and influence. But the FBI had also discovered something else, something that gave them hope for the future. They had discovered that even in the darkest corners of the mafia, there were still men and women of honor and integrity who were willing to stand up for what was right and fight against the forces of corruption. And it was this discovery that would ultimately prove to be the most significant legacy of Operation Donnie Brasco, as the FBI continued to build on the momentum of their investigation and push forward into the unknown. But that wasn't the end of the story, as the FBI soon discovered that the aftermath of Operation Donnie Brasco would be just as complex and challenging as the investigation itself. The years that followed Operation Donnie Brasco would be marked by a series of dramatic twists and turns, as the FBI continued to pursue the remnants of the Bonanno family and other mafia organizations. But they would also be marked by a growing sense of unease and uncertainty, as the FBI struggled to come to terms with the implications of what they had uncovered. The mafia was not just a criminal organization, but a complex web of relationships and alliances that extended far beyond the world of organized crime. And as the FBI delved deeper into this world, they began to realize that the line between good and evil was not always clear-cut, and that the truth was often far more complex and nuanced than they had initially suspected. But that wasn't the only challenge the FBI faced, as they also had to contend with the aftermath of Operation Donnie Brasco and the impact it had on the mafia and the wider community. The impact of Operation Donnie Brasco was felt far beyond the world of organized crime, as the FBI's investigation sparked a series of debates and discussions about the nature of corruption and the rule of law. It was a sobering realization, and one that raised uncomfortable questions about the extent to which the mafia had infiltrated American society. But it was also a reminder of the importance of law enforcement and the need for vigilance and determination in the face of corruption and deceit. And as the FBI continued to build on the momentum of their investigation, they knew that they had a long and difficult road ahead of them, as they sought to bring the mafia to justice and protect the American people from the forces of corruption. But that wasn't the end of the story, as the FBI soon discovered that the legacy of Operation Donnie Brasco would be felt for years to come, and that the impact of their investigation would be far more profound and far-reaching than they had ever imagined. When the FBI abruptly pulled Joseph Pistone out of the field in July of 1981, the decision was made not through standard administrative wrap-up, but under the urgent threat of bloodshed. Pistone was on the verge of being proposed for full membership, becoming a made man. To achieve that, he would have been required to participate in a contract killing. The Bureau could not allow an active agent to shed blood, but the moment Pistone vanished from the streets of Little Italy, the FBI faced an unprecedented dilemma. How do you break the truth to a criminal syndicate? The FBI had to delicately manage the withdrawal of their undercover agent, Joseph Pistone, without arousing suspicion from the Bonanno crime family. This was a high-stakes operation, as the slightest misstep could have resulted in severe consequences, not just for Pistone, but for the entire investigation. The Bureau had to consider the potential backlash from the mafia, who would likely seek revenge if they discovered they had been infiltrated. But that wasn't the only challenge the FBI faced. They also had to ensure that Pistone's disappearance wouldn't compromise the evidence they had gathered so far. The investigation had been years in the making, and the FBI couldn't afford to have it all undone by a mishandled extraction. As the FBI began to extract Pistone from the operation, they had to create a convincing cover story for his disappearance. They decided to stage a scenario where Pistone would be perceived as having been killed by a rival faction, thereby avoiding any suspicion that he was an undercover agent. But this plan was fraught with risk, as it relied on the mafia buying into the deception. If they didn't, the consequences would be dire. The FBI had to carefully manipulate the situation, using their knowledge of the mafia's inner workings to create a believable narrative. But just as they thought they had a handle on the situation, new information surfaced that threatened to upend the entire operation. It turned out that Pistone had become so deeply embedded in the Bonanno crime family that his disappearance would not go unnoticed, and the mafia would likely launch an investigation of their own to uncover the truth. The FBI's decision to extract Pistone was not taken lightly, and it was motivated by the realization that he had become too close to the inner circle of the Bonanno crime family. As an undercover agent, Pistone had been walking a tightrope, constantly balancing his loyalty to the FBI with the need to maintain his cover. But as he rose through the ranks, the risks became too great, and the Bureau knew they had to act. The problem was that Pistone's withdrawal would create a power vacuum, and the mafia would likely move to fill the gap. This could lead to a violent struggle for control, and the FBI would have to navigate this treacherous landscape to ensure that their operation remained intact. But that wasn't the strangest part, As the FBI delved deeper into the Bonanno crime family's activities, they discovered that Pistone's infiltration was just the tip of the iceberg. The more the FBI learned about the Bonanno crime family, the more they realized that Pistone's operation had uncovered a complex web of corruption and deceit. The mafia's reach extended far beyond the streets of Little Italy, and the FBI had stumbled upon a massive racketeering operation that involved some of the most powerful figures in organized crime. As the investigation continued to unfold, the FBI found themselves facing off against some of the most notorious gangsters of the time, including the infamous Carmine Galante. But despite the progress they had made, the FBI couldn't shake off the feeling that they were in over their heads. The mafia was a Hydra-like organization, and every time they thought they had cut off one head, another would emerge to take its place. The question on everyone's mind was, how far did the corruption go, and who else was involved? As the FBI dug deeper, they began to uncover a trail of evidence that led them to some unexpected places. They discovered that the Bonanno crime family had ties to other mafia families, and that they were involved in a range of illicit activities, from extortion and loan sharking to narcotics trafficking. But what was even more surprising was the level of corruption within the law enforcement community itself. The FBI found that some of their own agents had been compromised, and that there were moles within the organization who were feeding information to the mafia. This was a devastating blow, as it meant that the FBI couldn't even trust their own people. The investigation had just gotten a lot more complicated, and the stakes had been raised. The FBI had to navigate this treacherous landscape, all while keeping their operation intact and bringing the perpetrators to justice. But just as they thought they had a handle on the situation, new information surfaced that threatened to upend the entire operation. It turned out that Pistone's infiltration had also uncovered a deep-seated rivalry within the Bonanno crime family, one that could potentially lead to a full-blown gang war. The FBI had to walk a delicate balance, as they didn't want to spark a violent conflict that could result in innocent lives being lost. At the same time, they couldn't afford to let the mafia get the upper hand, as this would undermine the entire investigation. The situation was becoming increasingly volatile, and the FBI had to think on their feet to stay one step ahead of the mafia. But that wasn't the only challenge they faced. As they delved deeper into the world of organized crime, they began to realize that the lines between good and evil were not always clear-cut. As the investigation continued to unfold, the FBI found themselves confronting some difficult moral choices. They had to decide whether to prioritize the pursuit of justice or to protect the lives of those who had become embroiled in the operation. Pistone's infiltration had created a complex web of relationships, and the FBI had to navigate these delicate dynamics to achieve their goals. But the more they learned, the more they realized that the world of organized crime was not just about violence and corruption, it was also about loyalty, honor, and family. The mafia was a twisted mirror of society, reflecting both the best and worst aspects of human nature. And the FBI had to confront their own demons as they struggled to come to terms with the moral ambiguities of the operation. But what they didn't know was that the most shocking revelation was yet to come, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the case. The FBI's investigation had uncovered a vast array of evidence, from wiretaps and surveillance footage to eyewitness testimony and documentary records. But as they pieced together the puzzle, they began to realize that the truth was far more complex than they had initially suspected. The Bonanno crime family was just one part of a much larger landscape, a world of organized crime that spanned the globe. And at the heart of it all was a mysterious figure, a powerful player who had managed to stay one step ahead of the law. The FBI had to use all their resources and expertise to track down this elusive figure, to uncover the truth behind the operation and bring the perpetrators to justice. But as they closed in on their target, they couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched, that the mafia was waiting for them to make their next move. And then, just as they thought they had finally got their man, the unthinkable happened. The FBI's operation had been so successful that it had attracted the attention of the highest levels of law enforcement. The Justice Department had taken notice of the investigation, and they were keen to see it through to its conclusion. But as the FBI worked to bring the perpetrators to justice, they faced a new challenge: the prospect of taking on some of the most powerful figures in organized crime. The mafia would stop at nothing to protect their interests, and the FBI had to be prepared to face the consequences. The investigation had become a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with the FBI using every trick in the book to stay one step ahead of the mafia. But the mafia was a cunning foe, and they would not go down without a fight. The question on everyone's mind was, who would emerge victorious, the FBI or the mafia? The outcome was far from certain, as the investigation continued to unfold in unexpected ways. As the FBI worked to bring the perpetrators to justice, they had to navigate a complex web of legal and bureaucratic hurdles. The investigation had generated a vast amount of evidence, and the FBI had to ensure that it was handled properly to secure convictions. But the mafia was not going to go down without a fight, and they would use every trick in the book to discredit the evidence and undermine the investigation. The FBI had to be meticulous in their preparation, as the slightest mistake could result in the case being thrown out of court. The stakes were high, and the tension was palpable, as the FBI worked to build a watertight case against the perpetrators. But just as they thought they had finally got the upper hand, new information surfaced that threatened to blow the entire case wide open. The investigation had been ongoing for years, and the FBI had accumulated a vast amount of evidence. But as they worked to build their case, they began to realize that the truth was far more complex than they had initially suspected. The Bonanno crime family was just one part of a much larger landscape, a world of organized crime that spanned the globe. And at the heart of it all was a mysterious figure, a powerful player who had managed to stay one step ahead of the law. The FBI had to use all their resources and expertise to track down this elusive figure, to uncover the truth behind the operation and bring the perpetrators to justice. But as they closed in on their target, they couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched, that the mafia was waiting for them to make their next move. And then, just as they thought they had finally got their man, the unthinkable happened. The FBI received a tip that the mysterious figure was not who they thought it was, but someone far more powerful and elusive. The FBI's investigation had been a long and winding road, full of twists and turns that had led them down some unexpected paths. But as they finally closed in on their target, they realized that the truth was far more complex than they had ever imagined. The Bonanno crime family was just one part of a much larger landscape, a world of organized crime that spanned the globe. And at the heart of it all was a mysterious figure, a powerful player who had managed to stay one step ahead of the law. The FBI had to use all their resources and expertise to track down this elusive figure, to uncover the truth behind the operation and bring the perpetrators to justice. But as they closed in on their target, they couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched, that the mafia was waiting for them to make their next move. The investigation had become a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with the FBI using every trick in the book to stay one step ahead of the mafia. But the mafia was a cunning foe, and they would not go down without a fight. As the FBI worked to bring the perpetrators to justice, they had to navigate a complex web of legal and bureaucratic hurdles. The investigation had generated a vast amount of evidence, and the FBI had to ensure that it was handled properly to secure convictions. But the mafia was not going to go down without a fight, and they would use every trick in the book to discredit the evidence and undermine the investigation. The FBI had to be meticulous in their preparation, as the slightest mistake could result in the case being thrown out of court. The stakes were high, and the tension was palpable, as the FBI worked to build a watertight case against the perpetrators. But just as they thought they had finally got the upper hand, new information surfaced that threatened to blow the entire case wide open. The FBI received a tip that one of their own agents had been compromised and that the mafia had infiltrated the investigation. The question on everyone's mind was, who could they trust? The FBI's investigation had been a massive undertaking, involving hundreds of agents and thousands of hours of surveillance. But as they worked to bring the perpetrators to justice, they realized that the truth was far more complex than they had initially suspected. The Bonanno crime family was just one part of a much larger landscape, a world of organized crime that spanned the globe. And at the heart of it all was a mysterious figure, a powerful player who had managed to stay one step ahead of the law. The FBI had to use all their resources and expertise to track down this elusive figure, to uncover the truth behind the operation and bring the perpetrators to justice. But as they closed in on their target, They couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched, that the mafia was waiting for them to make their next move. The investigation had become a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with the FBI using every trick in the book to stay one step ahead of the mafia. But the mafia was a cunning foe, and they would not go down without a fight. The outcome was far from certain, as the investigation continued to unfold in unexpected ways. As the FBI worked to bring the perpetrators to justice, they had to navigate a complex web of alliances and rivalries within the mafia. The Bonanno crime family was just one of several powerful mafia families, and the FBI had to be careful not to spark a gang war. But the mafia was not the only player in the game, as the FBI had to contend with corrupt officials and businessmen who had ties to organized crime. The investigation had become a complex puzzle, with the FBI trying to piece together the evidence to build a watertight case. But just as they thought they had finally got the upper hand, new information surfaced that threatened to blow the entire case wide open. The FBI received a tip that a high-ranking government official had ties to the mafia, and that they had been feeding them information about the investigation. The question on everyone's mind was, how far did the corruption go, and who else was involved? The FBI's investigation had been a long and difficult journey, but they were finally closing in on their target. The Bonanno crime family was on the ropes, and the mafia was in disarray. But as the FBI worked to bring the perpetrators to justice, they realized that the truth was far more complex than they had initially suspected. The mafia was not just a simple criminal organization, but a complex web of alliances and rivalries that spanned the globe. And at the heart of it all was a mysterious figure, a powerful player who had managed to stay one step ahead of the law. The FBI had to use all their resources and expertise to track down this elusive figure, to uncover the truth behind the operation and bring the perpetrators to justice. But as they closed in on their target, a new layer of complexity emerged. It became clear that the Bonanno crime family was more entrenched and sophisticated than initially thought, with tentacles reaching deep into the world of organized crime. The FBI's undercover operation, led by Agent Joseph Pistone, aka Donnie Brasco, had managed to gain the trust of high-ranking members, but this also meant they were now privy to the family's most closely guarded secrets. As Pistone delved deeper, he found himself walking a thin line between loyalty to his FBI handlers and the loyalty demanded by his new mafia associates. The more Pistone learned, the more he realized that the Bonanno family's influence extended far beyond the streets of New York. They had connections with other crime families, both domestically and internationally, creating a vast network of corruption and deceit. But that wasn't the strangest part. As Pistone gained more access to the family's inner workings, he began to notice discrepancies in the stories told by different members. It seemed that even within the family, there were layers of deception and mistrust, making it difficult to discern fact from fiction. This raised questions about the true extent of the family's power and the identities of those pulling the strings from behind the scenes. As the investigation intensified, the FBI faced a new challenge: the moral implications of Pistone's deep cover. The longer he stayed undercover, the more he became embroiled in the family's activities, forced to participate in criminal acts to maintain his cover. This blurred the lines between right and wrong, putting Pistone in a precarious position. The FBI had to weigh the benefits of the operation against the potential risks to Pistone's safety and his own moral compass. But just as it seemed they were nearing a breakthrough, a sudden change in the family's hierarchy threw everything into chaos. A power struggle emerged, with different factions vying for control, and Pistone found himself caught in the middle. The power struggle within the Bonanno family added a new layer of urgency to the operation. With alliances shifting and tempers flaring, Pistone's cover was more at risk than ever. The FBI knew they had to act quickly to capitalize on the information they had gathered, but they also had to consider the potential fallout of their actions. One misstep could lead to Pistone's discovery and certain death. As the situation continued to unfold, the FBI was left wondering if they had underestimated the depth of the Bonanno family's influence and the true cost of taking them down. And now, with Pistone's life hanging in the balance, the question on everyone's mind was, how far would the FBI go to see justice served, and what would be the ultimate price of Operation Donnie Brasco?